Chapter 21 of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream by R. M. Ballantyne. Chapter 21. Curious Trees and Still More Curious Plains. An Interesting Discovery followed by a Sad One. Fate of Travellers in the Mountains. A Sudden Illness. Ned proves himself to be a friend in need and indeed, as well as an excellent doctor, hunter, cook, and nurse. Deer shooting by firelight. During the course of their wanderings among the mountains, our hero and his companion met with many strange adventures, and saw many strange sights, which, however, we cannot afford space to dwell upon here. Their knowledge in natural history, too, was wonderfully increased, for they were both observant men, and a school of nature is the best in which any one can study. Audubon, the hunter naturalist of America, knew this well, and few men have added so much as he to the sum of human knowledge in his peculiar department, while fewer still have so wonderfully enriched the pages of romantic adventure in wild, unknown regions. In these wanderings, too, Ned and Tom learned to know experimentally that truth is indeed stranger than fiction, and that if the writers of fairy tales had travelled more, they would have saved their imaginations a deal of trouble, and produced more extraordinary works. The size of the trees they encountered was almost beyond belief, though none of them surpassed the giant of which an account has been already given. Among other curious trees they found sugar pines growing in abundance in one part of the country. This is, perhaps, the most graceful of all the pines. With a perfectly straight and cylindrical stem and smooth bark, it rears its proud crest high above other trees, and flings its giant limbs abroad like a sentinel guarding the forest. The stem rises to about 4/5 of its height, perfectly free of branches. Above this point the branches spread out almost horizontally, drooping a little bit at the ends from the weight of the huge cones which they bear. These cones are about 1.5 feet long, and under each leaf lies a seed the size of a pea, which has an agreeably sweet taste, and is much esteemed by the Indians, who use it as an article of food. Another remarkable sight they saw was a plain of some miles in extent, completely covered with shattered pieces of quartz, which shone with specks and veins of pure gold. Of course they had neither time nor inclination to attempt the laborious task of pulverising this quartz in order to obtain the precious metal; but Ned moralised a little as they galloped over the plain, spurning the gold beneath their horses' hoofs as if it had been of no value whatever. They both puzzled themselves also to account for so strange an appearance, but the only solution that seemed to them at all admissible was, that a quartz vein had, at some early period of the world's history, been shattered by a volcanic eruption, and the plain thus strewn with gold. But from the contemplation of these and many other interesting sights and phenomena, we must pass to an event which seriously affected the future plans of the travellers. One beautiful evening, such an evening as, from its deep quiet and unusual softness, leaves a lasting impression on the memory, the two horsemen found themselves slowly toiling up the steep acclivity of a mountain ridge. Their advance was toilsome, for the way was rugged, and no track of any kind assisted them in their ascent. "I fear the poor horses will give in," said Ned, dismounting and looking back at his companion, who slowly followed him. "We are near the summit," answered Tom, "and they shall have a long rest there." As he spoke they both dismounted and advanced on foot, leading their fatigued horses by the bridles. "D'ye know," said Tom, with a sigh, "I feel more used up to day than I have been since we started on this journey. I think we had better encamp and have a cup of tea. There is a little left yet, if I mistake not." "With all my heart, Tom. I too feel inclined to rest, and " Ned paused, for at that moment they overtopped the highest edge of the ridge, and the view that burst upon them was well fitted to put to flight every previous train of thought. The ridge on which they stood rose several hundred feet above the level of the plain beyond, and commanded a view of unknown extent towards the far west. The richest possible sweep of country was spread out at their feet like a huge map, bathed in a glow of yellow sunshine. Lakes and streams, crags and rocks, sward and swamp and plain, undulating and abrupt, barren and verdant, all were there, and could be embraced in a single wide sweeping glance. It seemed to the entranced travellers like the very Garden of Eden. Waterfowl flew about in all directions, the whistling of their wings and their wild cries being mellowed by distance into pleasant music; and far away on the right, where a clear lake mirrored each tree on its banks, as if the image were reality, a herd of deer were seen cooling their sides and limbs in the water, while on the extreme horizon a line of light indicated the shores of the vast Pacific Ocean. Ere the travellers could find words to express their feelings, a rock with a piece of stick and a small rag attached to it attracted their attention. "We are not the first to have set their feet here, it seems," said Ned, pointing to the signal. "Strange," muttered Tom Collins, as they turned towards the rock. "That does not look like an Indian mark. Yet I would have thought that white men had never stood here before, for the spot is far removed from any known diggings, and, as we know fair well, is not easily reached." On gaining the rock, they found that the rag was a shred of linen, without mark of any kind to tell who had placed it there. "It must have been the freak of some Indian hunter," said Ned, examining the rock on which the little flagstaff was raised. "Say, no, here are some marks cut in the stone. Look here, Tom, can you decipher this? It looks like the letter D. D.B." "D.B.!" cried Tom Collins, with a degree of energy that surprised his friend. "Let me see." Tom carefully removed the moss, and cleared out the letters, which were unmistakable. "Who can D.B. have been?" said Ned. Tom looked up with a flushed countenance and a glittering eye, as he exclaimed, "Who? Who but Daniel Boone, Cooper's great hero, Hawkeye of the last of the Mohicans, Deerslayer, Leather Stocking. He has been here before us. Ay, brave spirit, long before other hunters had dared to venture far into the territory of the scalping, torturing, yelling Redskin, this bold heart had pushed westward, fearless and alone, until his eagle eye rested on the great Pacific. It must have been he. I have followed him, Ned, in spirit, throughout all his wild career, for I know him to be a real man and no fiction; but little did I think that I should see a spot where his manly foot had rested, or live to discover his farthest step in the far west." Ned Sinton listened with interest to the words of his friend, but he did not interrupt him, for he respected the deep emotions that swelled his heart and beamed from his flashing eye. "We spoke, Ned, some time ago, of historical associations," continued Tom. "Here are historical associations worth coming all this way to call up. Here are associations that touch my heart more than all the deeds of ancient chivalry. Ah! Daniel Boone, little didst thou think, when thy hawk's eye rested here, that in a few short years the land would be overrun by gold diggers from all ends of the earth." "But this flag," said Ned, "he could never have placed that here. It would have been swept away by storms years ago." "You're right," said Tom, turning over the stones that supported the staff. "Halloo! what have we here?" He pulled out a roll of oiled cloth as he spoke, and on opening it, discovered a scrap of paper on which were written in pencil the words, "Help us, for God's sake help us. We are perishing at the foot of the hill to the southward of this." No name or date was attached to this strange paper, but the purport of it was sufficiently clear, so, without wasting time in fruitless conjecture, the young men immediately sprang on their horses and rode down the hill in the direction indicated. The route proved more rugged and steep than that by which they had ascended, and for a considerable distance they wound their way between the trunks of a closely planted cypress grove, after passing which they emerged upon a rocky plain of small extent, at the further extremity of which a green oasis indicated the presence of a spring. Towards this they rode in silence. "Ah!" exclaimed Ned, in a tone of deep pity, as he reined up at the foot of an oak tree, "too late." They were indeed too late to succour the poor creatures who had placed the scrap of paper on the summit of that mountain ridge, in the faint hope that friendly hands might discover it in time. 6 dead forms lay at the foot of the oak, side by side, with their pale faces turned upwards, and the expression of extreme suffering still lingering on their shrunken features. It needed no living witness to tell their sad history. The skeletons of oxen, the broken cart, the scattered mining tools, and the empty provision casks showed clearly enough that they were emigrants, who had left their homesteads in the States, and tried to reach the gold regions of California by the terrible overland journey. They had lost their way among the dreary fastnesses of the mountains, travelled far from the right road to the mines, and perished at last of exhaustion and hunger on the very borders of the golden land. The grey-haired father of the family lay beside a young girl with his arm clasped round her neck. 2 younger men also lay near them, one lying as if, in dying, he had sought to afford support to the other. The bodies were still fresh, and a glance showed that nearly all of them were of one family. "Alas, Ned, had we arrived a few days sooner, we might have saved them," said Tom. "I think they must have been freed from their pains and sorrows here more than a week since," replied the other, fastening his horse to a tree, and proceeding to search the clothes of the unfortunates for letters or anything that might afford a clue to their identity. "We must stay here an hour or two, Tom, and bury them." No scrap of writing, however, was found, not even a book with a name on it, to tell who the strangers were. With hundreds of others, no doubt, they had left their homes, full of life and hope, to seek their fortunes in the land of gold, but the Director of man's steps had ordered it otherwise, and their golden dreams had ended with their lives in the unknown wilderness. The 2 friends covered the bodies with sand and stones, and, leaving them in their shallow grave, pursued their way. But they had not gone far when a few large drops of rain fell, and the sky became overcast with dark leaden clouds. "Ned," said Tom, anxiously, "I fear we shall be caught by the rainy season. It's awkward being so far from the settlements at such a time." "Oh, nonsense! Surely you don't mind a wetting?" cried Ned. "We can push on in spite of rain." "Can we?" retorted Tom, with unwonted gravity. "It's clear that you've never seen the rainy season, else you would not speak of it so lightly. Why, man, you seem to have lost pluck all of a sudden. Come, cheer up. Rain or no rain, I mean to have a good supper and a good night's rest, and here is just the spot that will suit us." Ned Sinton leaped off his horse as he spoke, and, fastening him to a tree, loosened the saddle girths, and set about preparing the encampment. Tom Collins assisted him. But neither the rallying of his comrade nor his own efforts could enable the latter to shake off the depression of spirits with which he was overpowered. That night the rain came down in torrents, and drenched the travellers to the skin, despite their most ingenious contrivances to keep it out. They spent the night in misery, and when morning broke, Ned found that his companion was smitten down with ague. Even Ned's buoyant spirits were swamped for a time at this unlooked for catastrophe, for the dangers of their position were not slight. It was clear that Tom would not be able to travel for many days, for his whole frame trembled when the fits came on, with a violence that seemed to threaten dislocation to all his joints. Ned felt that both their lives, under God, depended on his keeping well, and being able to procure food for and nurse his friend. At the same time he knew that the rainy season, if indeed it had not already begun, would soon set in, and perhaps render the country impassable. There was no use, however, in giving way to morbid fears, so Ned faced his difficulties manfully, and, remembering the promise which he had given his old uncle at parting from him in England, he began by offering up a short but earnest prayer at the sight of his friend's couch. "Ned," said Tom, sadly, as his companion ceased, "I fear that you'll have to return alone." "Come, come, don't speak that way, Tom. It isn't right. God is able to help us here as well as in cities. I don't think you are so ill as you fancy. The sight of these poor emigrants has depressed you. Cheer up, my boy, and I'll let you see that you were right when you said I could turn my hand to anything. I'll be hunter, woodcutter, cook, and nurse all at once, and see if I don't make you all right in a day or two. You merely want rest, so keep quiet for a little, till I make a sort of sheltered place to put you in." The sun broke through the clouds as he spoke, and shed a warm beam down on poor Tom, who was more revived by the sight of the cheering orb of day than by the words of his companion. In half an hour Tom was wrapped in the driest portion of the driest blanket, his wet habiliments were hung up before a roaring fire to dry, and a rude bower of willows covered with turf was erected over his head to guard him from another attack of rain should it come. But it didn't come. The sun shone cheerily all day, and Ned's preparations were completed before the next deluge came, so that when it descended on the following morning, comparatively little found its way to Tom's resting place. It was scarcely a resting place, however. Tom turned and groaned on his uneasy couch, and proved to be an uncommonly restive patient. He complained particularly when Ned left him for a few hours each day to procure fresh provisions; but he smiled, and confessed himself unreasonable when Ned returned, as he always did, with a dozen wild ducks, or several geese or hares attached to his belt, or a fat deer on his shoulders. Game of all kinds was plentiful, the weather improved, the young hunter's rifle was good, and his aim was true, so that, but for the sickness of his friend, he would have considered the life he led a remarkably pleasant one. As day after day passed by, however, and Tom Collins grew no better, but rather worse, he began to be seriously alarmed about him. Tom himself took the gloomiest view of his case, and at last said plainly he believed he was dying. At first, Ned sought to effect a cure by the simple force of kind treatment and care, but finding that this would not do, he bethought him of trying some experiments in the medicinal way. He chanced to have a box of pills with him, and tried one, although with much hesitation and fear, for he had got them from a miner who could not tell what they were composed of, but who assured him that they were a sovereign remedy for the blues. Ned, it must be confessed, was rather a reckless doctor. He was anxious, at the time he procured the pills, to relieve a poor miner who seemed to be knocked up with hard work, but who insisted that he had a complication of ailments. So Ned bought the pills for 20 times their value, and gave a few to the man, advising him at the same time to rest and feed well, which he did, and the result was a complete cure. Our hero did not feel so certain, however, that they would succeed as well in the present case, but he resolved to try their virtues, for Tom was so prostrate that he could scarcely be induced to whisper a word. When the cold fit seized him, he trembled so violently that his teeth rattled in his head, and when that passed off, it was followed by a burning fever, which was even worse to bear. At first he was restive, and inclined to be peevish under his illness, the result, no doubt, of a naturally robust constitution, struggling unsuccessfully against the attacks of disease; but when he was completely overcome, his irascibility passed away, and he became patient, sweet-tempered, and gentle as a child. "Come, Tom, my boy," said Ned one evening, advancing to the side of his companion's couch, and sitting down beside him, while he held up the pill. "Open your mouth and shut your eyes, as we used to say at school." "What is it?" asked the sick man faintly. "Never you mind. Patients have no business to know what their doctors prescribed. It's intended to cure ague, and that's enough for you to know. If it doesn't cure you, it's not my fault anyhow. Open your mouth, sir." Tom smiled sadly, and obeyed. The pill was dropped in, a spoonful of water added to float it down, and it disappeared. But the pill had no effect whatever. Another was tried with like result, or rather with like absence of all result, and at last the box was finished without the sick man being a whit the better or the worse for them. This was disheartening, but Ned, having begun to dabble in medicines, felt an irresistible tendency to go on. Like the tiger who has once tasted blood, he could not now restrain himself. "I think you're a little better to night, Tom," he said, on the third evening after the administration of the first pill. "I'm making you a decoction of bark here that will certainly do you good." Tom shook his head, but said nothing. He evidently felt that a negative sign was an appropriate reply to the notion of his being better, or of any decoction whatever doing him good. However, Ned stirred the panful of bark and water vigorously, chatting all the while in a cheering tone, in order to keep up his friend's spirits, while the blaze of the camp fire lit up his handsome face, and bathed his broad chest and shoulders with a ruddy glow, that rendered still more pallid the lustre of the pale stars overhead. "It's lucky the rain has kept off so long," he said, without looking up from the mysterious decoction over which he bent with the earnest gaze of an alchemist. "I do believe that has something to do with your being better, my boy. Either that, or the pills, or both." Ned totally ignored the fact that his friend did not admit that he was better. "And this stuff," he continued, "will set you up in a day or two. It's as good as quinine any day, and you've no notion what wonderful cures that medicine effects. It took me a long time, too, to find the right tree. I wandered over 2 or 3 leagues of country before I came upon one. Luckily it was a fine sunny day, and I enjoyed it much. I wish you had been with me, Tom. But you'll be all right soon. I lay down, too, once or twice in the sunshine, and put my head in the long grass, and tried to fancy myself in a miniature forest. Did you ever try that, Tom?" Ned looked round as he spoke, but the sick man gave a languid smile and shut his eyes, so he resumed his stirring of the pot and his rambling talk. "You've no idea, if you never tried it, how one can deceive oneself in that way. I often did it at home, when I was a little boy. I used to go away with a companion into a grass field, and selecting a spot where the grass was long and tangled, and mixed with various kinds of weeds, we used to lie flat down with our faces as near to the ground as possible, and gaze through the grass stems until we fancied the blades were trees, and the pebbles were large rocks, and the clods were mountains. Sometimes a huge beetle would crawl past, and we instantly thought of St. George and the Dragon, and as the unwieldy monster came stumbling on through the forest, we actually became quite excited, and could scarcely believe that what we tried to imagine was not real." "We seldom spoke on these occasions, my companion and I," continued Ned, suspending the stirring of the decoction and filling his pipe, as he sat down close to the blazing logs. "Speaking, we found, always broke the spell, so we agreed to keep perfect silence for as long a time as possible. You must try it, Tom, some day, for although it may seem to you a childish thing to do, there are many childish things which, when done in a philosophical spirit, are deeply interesting and profitable to men." Ned ceased talking for a few minutes while he ignited his pipe. When he spoke again, his thoughts had wandered into a new channel. "I'm sorry we have no fresh meat to day," he said, looking earnestly at his friend. "The remainder of that hare is not very savoury, but we must be content. I walked all the country round to day without getting within range of any living thing. There were plenty both of deer and birds, but they were so wild I could not get near them. It would matter little if you were well, Tom, but you require good food just now, my poor fellow. Do you feel better to night?" Tom groaned, and said that he felt easier, in a very uneasy voice, after which they both relapsed into silence, and no sound was heard save the crackling of the logs, and the bubbling of the mysterious decoction in the pot. Suddenly Tom uttered a slight hiss, that peculiar sound so familiar to backwoods ears, by which hunters indicate to each other that something unusual has been observed, and that they had better be on the alert. Ned Sinton's nerves were of that firm kind which can never be startled or taken by surprise. He did not spring to his feet, but, quick as thought, he stretched forth his long arm, and, seizing his rifle, cocked it, while he glanced at his friend's eye to see in what direction he was looking. Tom pointed eagerly with his thin hand straight across the fire. Ned turned in that direction, and at once saw the objects which had attracted his attention. 2 bright gleaming balls shone in the dark background of the forest, like 2 lustrous Irish diamonds in a black field of bog oak. He knew at once that they were the eyes of a deer, which, with a curiosity well known as peculiar to many wild animals, had approached the fire to stare at it. Ned instantly threw forward his rifle. The light of the fire enabled him easily to align the sights on the glittering eyes. The deadly contents belched forth, and a heavy crash told that his aim had been true. "Bravo!" shouted Tom Collins, forgetting his ailments in the excitement of the moment, while Ned threw down his rifle, drew his hunting knife, sprang over the fire, and disappeared in the surrounding gloom. In a few minutes he returned with a fine deer on his shoulders. "So ho, my boy," he cried, flinging the carcass down. "That was a lucky shot. We shall sup well to night, thanks to curiosity, which is a most useful quality in beast as well as man. But what's wrong? You look pale and You don't mean to say you're laughing?" Tom was indeed pale, for the sudden excitement, in his exhausted condition, had been too much for him, yet there did seem a peculiar expression about the corners of his mouth that might have been the remains of a laugh. "Ned," he said faintly, "the decoction's all gone." Ned sprang up and ran to the fire, where, sure enough, he found the pan, over which he had bent so long with necromantic gaze, upset, and most of the precious liquid gone. "Ha!" he cried, catching up the pot, "not all gone, lad, so your rejoicing was premature. There's quite enough left yet to physic you well, and it's in a fit state to be taken, so open your mouth at once, and be a good boy." A little of the medicine, mixed in water, was administered, and Tom, making a wry face, fell back on his couch with a sigh. Immediately after, he was seized with, perhaps, the severest shaking fit he had yet experienced, so that Ned could not help recalling the well known caution, so frequently met with on medicine vials, "When taken, to be well shaken," despite the anxiety he felt for his friend. But soon after, the trembling fit passed away, and Tom sank into a quiet slumber, the first real rest he had enjoyed for several days. Ned felt his pulse and his brow, looked long and earnestly into his face, nodded approvingly once or twice, and, having tucked the blankets gently in round the sick man, he proceeded to prepare supper. He removed just enough of the deer's skin to permit of a choice morsel being cut out. This he put into the pot, and made thereof a rich and savoury soup, which he tasted, and, if smacking one's lips and tasting it again twice indicated anything, the soup was good. But Ned Sinton did not eat it. That was Tom's supper, and was put just near enough the fire to keep it warm. This being done, Ned cut out another choice morsel of deer's meat, which he roasted and ate, as only those can eat who are well, and young, and robust, and in the heart of the wilderness. Then he filled his pipe, sat down close to Tom's couch, placed his back against a tree, crossed his arms on his breast, and smoked and watched the whole night long. He rose gently several times during the night, however, partly for the purpose of battling off his tendency to sleep, and partly for the purpose of replenishing the fire and keeping the soup warm. But Tom Collins took no supper that night. Ned longed very much to see him awake, but he didn't. Towards morning, Ned managed for some time to fight against sleep by entering into a close and philosophical speculation as to what was the precise hour at which that pot of soup could not properly be called supper, but would merge into breakfast. This question still remained unsettled in his mind when grey dawn lit up the peaks of the eastern hills, and he was still debating it, and nodding like a Chinese mandarin, and staring at intervals like a confused owl, when the sun shot over the tree tops, and, alighting softly on the sleeper's face, aroused him. Tom awoke refreshed, ate his breakfast with relish, took his medicine without grumbling, smiled on his comrade, and squeezed his hand as he went to sleep again, with a heavy sigh of comfort. From that hour he mended rapidly, and in a week after he was well enough to resume his journey. Chapter 21. Of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream, by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 22. Powerful effects of gold on the aspect of things in general. The doings at Little Creek diggings. Larry becomes speculative, and digs a hole which nearly proves the grave of many miners. Captain Bunting takes a fearful dive. Ah wow is smitten to the earth. A mysterious letter, and a splendid dish. We must now beg our reader to turn with us to another scene. The appearance of Little Creek diggings altered considerably, and for the worse, after Ned Sinton and Tom Collins left. A rush of miners had taken place in consequence of the reports of the successful adventurers who returned to Sacramento for supplies, and, in the course of a few weeks, the whole valley was swarming with eager gold hunters. The consequence of this was that laws of a somewhat stringent nature had to be made. The ground was measured off into lots of about 10 feet square, and apportioned to the miners. Of course, in so large and rough a community, there was a good deal of crime, so that Judge Lynch's services were frequently called in. But upon the whole, considering the circumstances of the colony, there was much less than might have been expected. At the time of which we write, namely, several weeks after the events narrated in our last chapter, the whole colony was thrown into a state of excitement in consequence of large quantities of gold having been discovered on the banks of the stream, in the ground on which the log huts and tents were erected. The result of this discovery was that the whole place was speedily riddled with pits and their concomitant mud heaps, and to walk about after nightfall was a difficult as well as a dangerous amusement. Many of the miners pulled down their tents and began to work upon the spots on which they previously stood. Others began to dig all round their wooden huts, until these rude domiciles threatened to become insular, and a few pulled their dwellings down in order to get at the gold beneath them. One man, as he sat on his doorstep smoking his pipe after dinner, amused himself by poking the handle of an axe into the ground, and unexpectedly turned up a small nugget of gold worth several dollars. In 10 minutes there was a pit before his door, big enough to hold a sheep, and before night he realised about $50. Another, in the course of 2 days, dug out $100 behind his tent, and all were more or less fortunate. At this particular time it happened that Captain Bunting had been seized with one of his irresistible and romantic wandering fits, and had gone off with the blunderbuss to hunt in the mountains. Maxton, having heard of better diggings elsewhere, and not caring for the society of our adventurers when Ned and Tom were absent, had bid them good bye, and gone off with his pick and shovel on his shoulder, and his prospecting pan in his hand, no one knew whither. Bill Jones was down at Sacramento purchasing provisions, as the prices at the diggings were ruinous, and Ko Sing had removed with one of the other Chinamen to another part of the creek. Thus it came to pass that Larry O'Neil and Ah wow, the Chinaman, were left alone to work out the claims of the party. One fine day Larry and his comrade were seated in the sunshine, concluding their midday meal, when a Yankee passed and told them of the discoveries that had been made further down the settlement. "Good luck to you," said Larry, nodding facetiously to the man, as he put a tin mug to his lips and drained its contents to the bottom. "Ha! It's the poteen I'm fond of. Not but that I've seen better. Faix, I've seldom tasted worse. But there's a virtue in goold digging that would make Accafortis go down like milk, it would. Will you try a drop?" Larry filled the pannikin as he spoke, and handed it to the Yankee, who, nothing loath, drained it and returned it empty, with thanks. "They're digging goold out of the cabin floors, are they?" said Larry, wiping his mouth with the sleeve of his shirt. "They air," answered the man. "One feller dug up $300 yesterday, from the very spot where he's been snoring on the last 6 months." "Ah, then that's a party little sum," said Larry, with a leer that showed he didn't believe a word of it. "Does he expect more to-morrow, think you?" "Don't know," said the man, half offended at the doubt thus cast on his veracity. "You better go and ax him. Good day, stranger," and the Yankee strode away rapidly. Larry scratched his head. Then he rubbed his nose, and then his chin, without apparently deriving any particular benefit from these actions. After that he looked up at Ah wow, who was seated cross-legged on the ground opposite to him, smoking, and asked him what was his opinion. "Dunno," said the Chinaman, without moving a muscle of his stolid countenance. "Oh, you're an entertainin' cratur, you are. I'll just make a hole here where I sit, and see what comes of it. Sure, it's better nor doing nothin'." Saying this, Larry refilled his empty pipe, stretched himself at full length on his side, rested his head on his left hand, and smoked complacently for 3 minutes; after which he took up the long sheath knife, with which he had just cut up his supper, and began carelessly to turn over the sod. "Sure, there is goold," he said, on observing several specks of the shining metal, As he dug deeper down, he struck upon a hard substance, which, on being turned up, proved to be a piece of quartz the size of a hen's egg, in which rich lumps and veins of gold were embedded. "Me eye niver!" shouted the Irishman, starting up and throwing away his pipe in his excitement. "If it isn't a nugget! Hooray! Where's the pick?" Larry overturned the Chinaman, who sat in his way, darted into the tent for his pick and shovel, and in 5 minutes was a foot down into the earth. He came upon a solid rock, however, much to his chagrin, a few inches further down. "Faix, I'll tell you what I'll do," he said, as a new idea struck him. "I'll dig inside of the tent. It'll keep the sun and the rain off." This remark was made half to himself and half to Ah wow, who, having gathered himself up and resumed his pipe, was regarding him with as much interest as he ever regarded anything. As Ah wow made no objection and did not appear inclined to volunteer an opinion, Larry entered the tent, cleared all the things away into one corner, and began to dig in the centre of it. It was fortunate that he adopted this plan. First, because the rainy season having now set in, the tent afforded him shelter, and secondly, because the soil under the tent turned out to be exceedingly rich. So much so that in the course of the next few days he and the Chinaman dug out upwards of $1,000. But the rains, which for some time past had given indubitable hints that they meant to pay a long visit to the settlement, at last came down like a waterspout, and flooded Larry and his comrade out of the hole. They cut a deep trench round the tent, however, to carry off the water, and continued their profitable labour unremittingly. The inside of the once comfortable tent now presented a very remarkable appearance. All the property of the party was thrust into the smallest possible corner, and Larry's bed was spread out above it. The remainder of the space was a yawning hole 6 feet deep, and a mound of earth about 4 feet high. This earth formed a sort of breastwork, over which Larry had to clamber night and morning in leaving and returning to his couch. The Chinaman slept in his own little tent hard by. There was another inconvenience attending this style of mining which Larry had not foreseen when he adopted it, and which caused the tent of our adventurers to become a sort of public nuisance. Larry had frequently to go down to the stream for provisions, and Ah wow, being given to sleep when no one watched him, took advantage of these opportunities to retire to his own tent. The consequence was, that strangers who chanced to look in passing, frequently fell headlong into the hole ere they were aware of its existence, and on more than one occasion Larry returned and found a miner in the bottom of it with his neck well nigh broken. To guard against this, he hit upon the plan of putting up a cautionary ticket. He purchased a flat board and a pot of black paint, with which he wrote the words, "Mind your feet, there's a big hole," and fixed it up over the entrance. The device answered very well in as far as those who could read were concerned, but as there were many who could not read at all, and who mistook the ticket for the sign of a shop or store, the accidents became rather more frequent than before. The Irishman at last grew desperate, and taking Ah wow by the pigtail, vowed that if he deserted his post again, he'd blow out all the brains he had, if he had any at all, and if that wouldn't do, he'd cut 'em up into mincemeat, so he would. The Chinaman evidently thought him in earnest, for he fell on his knees and promised, with tears in his eyes, that he would never do it again, or words to that effect. One day Larry and Ah wow were down in the hole labouring for gold as if it were life. It was a terribly rainy day, so bad that it was almost impossible to keep the water out. Larry had clambered out of the hole and was seated on the top of the mud heap, resting himself and gazing down upon his companion, who slowly, but with the steady regularity of machinery, dug out the clay and threw it on the heap, when a voice called from without. "Is this Mr. Edward Sinton's tent?" "It is that same," cried Larry, rising. "Don't come in, or it'll be worse for you." "Here's a letter for him, then, and $20 to pay." "Musha! But it's chape postage," said Larry, lifting the curtain and stepping out. "Couldn't you say 30 now?" "Come, down with the cash and none of your jaw," said the man, who was a surly fellow, and did not seem disposed to stand joking. "Oh, be all manes, yer honour," retorted Larry, with mock servility, as he counted out the money. "Av it wouldn't displaise your lordship, may I take the presumption to ax how the sail came to be broken?" "I know nothing about it," answered the man, as he pocketed the money. "I found it on the road between this and Sacramento, and as I was passing this way anyhow, I brought it on." "Ah, then, it was a great kindness entirely to go so far out o' your way, and that for a stranger too, and for nothin', or next thing to it," said Larry, looking after the man as he walked away. "Well, now," he continued, re-entering the tent, and seating himself again on the top of the mud heap, while he held the letter in his hand at arm's length, "this bates all, and what am I to do with it? Sure, it's not right to break the seal of another man's letter, but then it's broke already, and there can be no sin in reading it. Maybe," he continued, with a look of anxiety, "the poor lad's ill, or dead, and he's wrote to say so. Sure, I would like to read it, if I only know'd how, but me edication's been forgot, bad luck to the schoolmasters. I can only make out big print, one letter at a time." The poor man looked wistfully at the letter, feeling that it might possibly contain information of importance to all of them, and that delay in taking action might cause irreparable misfortune. While he meditated what had best be done, and scanned the letter in all directions, a footstep was heard outside, and the hearty voice of Captain Bunting shouted, "Ship ahoy! Who's within, boys?" "Hurroo, captain!" shouted Larry, jumping up with delight. "Mind your foot, captain dear, don't come in." "Why not?" inquired the captain, as he lifted the curtain. "Sure, it's no use tellin' ye now," said Larry, as Captain Bunting fell head foremost into Ah wow's arms, and drove that worthy creature, as he himself would have said, stern foremost, into the mud and water at the bottom. The captain happened to have a haunch of venison on his shoulder, and the blunderbuss under his arm, so that the crash and the splash, as they all floundered in the mud, were too much for Larry, who sat down again on the mud heap and roared with laughter. It is needless to go further into the details of this misadventure. Captain Bunting and the Chinaman were soon restored to the upper world, happily unhurt; so, having changed their garments, they went into Ah wow's tent to discuss the letter. "Let me see it, Larry," said the captain, sitting down on an empty port cask. Larry handed him the missive, and he read as follows: "San Francisco, Edward Sinton, Esquire, Little Creek Diggings. My dear sir, I have just time before the post closes to say that I only learned a few days ago that you were at Little Creek, otherwise I should have written sooner to say that." Here the captain seemed puzzled. "Now, ain't that aggravatin'?" he said. "The seal has torn away the most important bit of the letter. I wish I had the villains by the nose that opened it. Look here, Larry, can you guess what it was?" Larry took the letter, and, after scrutinising it with intense gravity and earnestness, returned it with the remark that it was "beyont him entirely." "That," said the captain, again attempting to read, "that something great success. So you and Captain Bunting had better come down at once. Believe me, my dear sir, yours faithfully, John Thompson." "Now," remarked the captain, with a look of chagrin, as he laid down the letter, folded his hands together, and gazed into Larry's grave visage, "nothin' half so tantalisin' as that has happened to me since the time when my good ship, the Roving Bess, was cast ashore at San Francisco." "It's provokin'," replied Larry, "and perplexin'." "It's most unfortunate, too," continued the captain, knitting up his visage, "that Sinton should be away just at this time, without rudder, chart, or compass, and bound for no port that any one knows of. Why, the fellow may be deep in the heart of the Rocky Mountains, for all I can tell. I might start off at once without him, but maybe that would be of no use. What can it be that old Thompson's so anxious about? Why didn't the old figurehead use his pen more freely? His tongue goes fast enough to drive the engines of a 74. What is to be done?" Although Captain Bunting asked the question with thorough earnestness and much energy, looking first at Larry and then at Ah wow, he received no reply. The former shook his head, and the latter stared at him with a steady, dead intensity, as if he wished to stare him through. After a few minutes' pause, Larry suddenly asked the captain if he was hungry, to which the latter replied that he was, whereupon the former suggested that it was worth while cooking the haunch of venison, and offered to do it in a peculiar manner that had been taught to him not long ago by a hunter who had passed that way, and fallen into the hole in the tent and sprained his ankle, so that he, Larry, was obliged to "kape him for a week, and trate him to the best o' the time." The proposal was agreed to, and Larry, seizing the haunch, which was still covered with the mud contracted in the hole, proceeded to exhibit his powers as a cook. The rain, which had been coming down as if a second flood were about to deluge the earth, had ceased at this time, and the sun succeeded for a few hours in struggling through the murky clouds, and pouring a flood of light and heat over hill and plain; the result of which was that, along the whole length of Little Creek, there was an eruption of blankets, and shirts, and inexpressibles, and other garments, which stood much in need of being dried, and which, as they fluttered and flapped their many-coloured folds in the light breeze, gave the settlement the appearance, as Captain Bunting expressed it, of being "dressed from stem to stern." The steam that arose from these habiliments, and from the soaking earth, and from the drenched forest, covered the face of nature with a sort of luminous mist that was quite cheering, by contrast with the leaden gloom that had preceded it, and filled with a romantic glow the bosoms of such miners as had any romance left in their natures. Larry O'Neil was one of these, and he went about his work whistling violently. We will not take upon us to say how much of his romance was due to the haunch of venison. We would not, if called on to do it, undertake to say how much of the romance and enjoyment of a picnic party would evaporate if it were suddenly announced that the hamper had been forgotten, or that it had fallen and the contents been smashed and mixed. We turn from such ungenerous and gross contemplations to the cooking of that haunch of venison, which, as it was done after a fashion never known to Sawyer, and may be useful in after years to readers of this chronicle, whose lot it may be perchance to stand in need of such knowledge, we shall carefully describe. It is not necessary to enlarge upon the preliminaries. We need hardly say that Larry washed off the mud, and that he passed flattering remarks upon his own abilities and prowess, and in very irreverent tones and terms addressed Ah wow, who smoked his pipe and looked at him. All that, and a great deal more, we leave to our reader's well-known and vivid imagination. Suffice it that the venison was duly washed, and a huge fire, with much difficulty, kindled, and a number of large stones put into it to heat. This done, Larry cut off a lump of meat from the haunch, a good deal larger than his own head, which wasn't small, the skin with the hair on being cut off along with the meat. A considerable margin of flesh was then pared off from the lump, so as to leave an edging of hide all round, which might overlap the remainder, and enclose it, as it were, in a natural bag. At this stage of the process Larry paused, looked admiringly at his work, winked over the edge of it at Ah wow, and went hastily into the tent, whence he issued with 2 little tin canisters, one containing pepper, the other salt. "Why, you beat the French all to nothin'," remarked the captain, who sat on an upturned tea box, smoking and watching the proceedings. "Ah, then, don't speak, captain; it'll spile your appetite," said Larry, sprinkling the seasoning into the bag, and closing it up by means of a piece of cord. He then drew the red-hot stones and ashes from the fire, and, making a hotbed thereof, placed the venison dumpling, if we may be allowed the term, on the centre of it. Before the green hide was quite burned through, the dish was cooked, as Yankees express it, to a curiosity, and the tasting thereof would have evoked from an alderman a look, he would have been past speaking, of ecstasy, while a lady might have exclaimed, "Delicious!" or a schoolboy have said, or some such term which ought only to be used in reference to intellectual treats, and should never be applied to such low matters as meat and drink. CHAPter 22. Of the Golden Dream. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Golden Dream, by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 23. The Rainy Season and its Effects. Disease and Misery at Little Creek. Reappearance of Old Friends. An Emigrant's Death. An Unexpected Arrival. Captain Bunting, after 2 days' serious consideration, made up his mind to go down alone to San Francisco, in order to clear up the mystery of the letter, and do all that he could personally in the absence of his friend. To resolve, however, was easy; to carry his resolution into effect was almost impracticable, in consequence of the inundated state of the country. It was now the middle of November, and the rainy season, which extends over 6 months of the year, was in full play. Language is scarcely capable of conveying, to those who have not seen it, an adequate idea of how it rained at this period of the year. It did not pour; there were no drops; it roared, a cataract of never-ending ramrods, as thick as your finger, straight down from the black sky right through to the very vitals of the earth. It struck the tents like shot, and spirited through the tightest canvas in the form of Scotch mist. It swept down cabin chimneys and put out the fires. It roared through every crevice and rent and seam of the hills in mad cataracts, and swelled up the little creek into a mighty surging river. All work was arrested. Men sat in their tents on mud heaps that melted from below them, or lay on logs that well nigh floated away with them. But there was not so much grumbling as one might have expected. It was too tremendous to be merely annoying. It was sublimely ridiculous, so men grinned and bore it. But there were many poor miners there, alas, who could not regard that season in a light manner. There were dozens of young and middle-aged men whose constitutions, although good perhaps, were not robust, and who ought never to have ventured to seek their fortunes in the gold regions; men who might have lived their full time, and have served their day and generation usefully in the civilised regions of the world, but who, despite the advice of friends probably, and certainly despite the warnings of experienced travellers and authors, rushed eagerly to California to find, not a fortune, but a grave. Dysentery, scurvy in its worst and most loathsome type, ague, rheumatism, sciatica, consumption, and other diseases, were now rife at the diggings, cutting down many a youthful plant, and blasting many a golden dream. Doctors, too, became surprisingly numerous; but these disciples of Aesculapius failed to effect cures, and as their diplomas, when sought for, were not forthcoming, they were ultimately banished en masse by the indignant miners. 1 or 2 old hunters and trappers turned out in the end to be the most useful doctors, and effected a good many cures with the simple remedies they had become acquainted with among the red men. What rendered things worse was that provisions became scarce, and therefore enormously dear. No fresh vegetables of any kind were to be had. Salt, greasy, and rancid pork, bear's meat, and venison were all the poor people could procure, although many a man there would have given $1,000, ay, all he possessed, for a single meal of fresh potatoes. The men smitten with scurvy had, therefore, no chance of recovering. The valley became a huge hospital, and the banks of the stream a cemetery. There were occasional lulls, however, in this dismal state of affairs. Sometimes the rain ceased, the sun burst forth in irresistible splendour, and the whole country began to steam like a cauldron. A cart, too, succeeded now and then in struggling up with a load of fresh provisions, reviving a few sinking spirits for a time, and almost making the owner's fortune; but, at the best, it was a drearily calamitous season, one which caused many a sick heart to hate the sight and name of gold, and many a digger to resolve to quit the land and all its treasures at the first opportunity. Doubtless, too, many deep and earnest thoughts of life, and its aims and ends, filled the minds of some men at that time. It is often in seasons of adversity that God shows to men how mistaken their views of happiness are, and how mad as well as sinful it is in them to search for joy and peace apart from, and without the slightest regard for, the Author of all felicity. Yes, there is reason to hope and believe that many seeds of eternal life were sown by the Saviour, and watered by the Holy Spirit, in that disastrous time of disease and death, seed which, perhaps, is now blessing and fertilizing many distant regions of the world. In one of the smallest and most wretched of the huts, at the entrance of the valley of Little Creek, lay a man whose days on earth were evidently few. The hut stood apart from the others in a lonely spot, as if it shrank from observation, and was seldom visited by the miners, who were too much concerned about their own misfortunes to care much for those of others. Here Kate Morgan sat by the couch of her dying brother, endeavouring to soothe his last hours by speaking to him in the most endearing terms, and reading passages from the Word of God, which lay open on her knee. But the dying man seemed to derive little comfort from what she said or read. His restless eye roamed anxiously round the wretched hut, while his breath came short and thick from between his pale lips. "Shall I read to you, darling?" said the woman, bending over the couch to catch the faint whisper, which was all the poor man had strength to utter. Just then, ere he could reply, the clatter of hoofs was heard, and a bronzed, stalwart horseman was seen through the doorless entrance of the hut, approaching at a brisk trot. Both horse and man were of immense size, and they came on with that swinging, heavy tread which gives the impression of irresistible weight and power. The rider drew up suddenly, and leaping off his horse, cried, "Can I have a draught of water, my good woman?" as he fastened the bridle to a tree, and strode into the hut. Kate rose hurriedly, and held up her finger to impose silence, as she handed the stranger a can of water. But he had scarcely swallowed a mouthful when his eye fell on the sick man. Going gently forward to the couch, he sat down beside it, and, taking the invalid's wrist, felt his pulse. "Is he your husband?" inquired the stranger in a subdued voice. "No, sir, my brother." "Does he like to have the Bible read to him?" "Sometimes, but before his voice failed he was always crying out for the priest. He's a Catholic, sir, though I'm not one myself, and thinks he can't be saved unless he sees the priest." The stranger took up the Bible, and turning towards the man, whose bright eyes were fixed earnestly upon him, read, in a low, impressive voice, several of those passages in which a free salvation to the chief of sinners is offered through Jesus Christ. He did not utter a word of comment, but he read with deep solemnity, and paused ever and anon to look in the face of the sick man as he read the blessed words of comfort. The man was not in a state either to listen to arguments or to answer questions, so the stranger wisely avoided both, and gently quitted the hut after offering up a brief prayer, and repeating twice the words, "Jesus says, Him that cometh to me I will in no wise cast out." Kate followed him out, and thanked him earnestly for his kindness, while tears stood in her eyes. "Have you no friends or relations here but him?" inquired the stranger. "Not one. There was one man as came to see us often when we stayed in a lonesome glen further up the creek, but we've not seen him since we came here. More be token he didn't know we were going to leave, and we went off in a hurry, for my poor brother was impatient, and thought the change would do him good. Take this, you'll be the better of it." The stranger thrust a quantity of silver into Kate's hand, and sprang upon his horse. "I don't need it, thank ye," said Kate hurriedly. "But you may need it. At any rate, he does. Stay, what was the name of the man who used to visit you?" "O'Neill, sir, Larry O'Neill." "Indeed! He is one of my mates. My name is Sinton, Edward Sinton. You will hear from me again ere long." Ned put spurs to his horse as he spoke, and in another moment was out of sight. CHAPTER 23.